I arrived on 4/20 at a rental cabin 2 miles from downtown Leavenworth in Washington state. First night, I heard a wood knock, as we're going to be about 10 p.m. Did not think much of it, rather than it being odd and startling me. Next evening, we were in the hot tub, about 8 p.m. Still light outside. My husband heard 2 wood knocks. I discounted it, stating likely deer. About an hour later, he went out to our car and heard another knock. At this point, I started to think maybe it was a Bigfoot, but actually hoping not. I went to bed around 10 p.m. and shortly after, I got into bed, still wide awake, and I heard a loud rock hitting the side of the wall behind my head. Then, heard another less loud rock sound hitting the wall of the bedroom next to me on the same wall. In the morning, I went out to see if I could find the rocks, and believe I did. There are not that many rocks on the ground, and the ones that were embedded into the ground. 2 rocks were lying on top of the ground and did not appear that they had been there long in the weather. There was a bigger rock on my bedroom side, and a smaller one on the other side. A follow-up investigation report was done by BFR investigator Jeff Sidebottom. Spoke with the witness, and she seems very credible. Her husband was also a witness. April 20th. They arrived at the Bear Paw rental cabin near Leavenworth, Washington, on April 20th. The weather was hot and clear. The cabin sits higher up on a hill than the ones around it. There are 2 hills in the back that form a V shape down to the bottom behind the cabin. They went to bed around 10:30 p.m. The witness described hearing 1 loud distinct wood knock. April 21st. Weather was 70 degrees or so, sunny. They were sitting in the hot tub and playing some jazz music a bit loud, and she heard 2 loud distinct wood knocks. She believes these were within 50 feet or so of the hills behind the cabin. They would go to bed around 10 p.m., and around 10:30 p.m., a large rock hits the side of the bedroom wall. They were sleeping in separate rooms due to bad mattresses, and a large rock hit the side of the cabin on her husband's bedroom wall. The husband claimed he could hear something rustling loudly in the woods behind the cabin. He looked and saw 2 deer come to the base of the V, made by the hills, and then bolt back the way they came, as if spooked by something. That morning, the witness found a few rocks on top of the soil, while the others were embedded from sitting so long. Around 8:30 p.m., they were sitting inside and she had her back to the wall when a large rock hit the living room wall of the cabin. April 23rd. The weather was cloudy and a bit cooler now. The husband put apples out in different areas and did some wood knocks and tried some calls. They said no activity at all that day or night, other than seeing some wild turkey. April 24th. Weather was rainy and cloudy. Virtually no activity. April 25th. The deck was scuffed up near the hot tub, which sits next to a game trail. Part of the deck is wood, and part is Trex. She said it looked similar to deer hooves, but deeper, and the ground was dry. There was a fresh gouge out the back deck, and there were claw marks everywhere. Some were thin and long, and she described them as 4 per print. The husband had heard some scuffling or something on the deck that night, but never looked to see what it might be. When you enter Kingman County from east on 60th Street, our encounter was on the first bridge you come to. This creature was on the west bank, just north of the bridge. By the way, this happened May 17th of 2021, not even a month ago from this reporting. It was also pretty thickly wooded right there, but surrounded by farmland. I'm handicapped, so I can't walk to where he was, but my son could, but I didn't even think of it. It just happened a day before yesterday, and it's been raining at the time of writing this. A follow-up was done by BFRO investigator Matthew Moneymaker. I spoke with the witness, Patricia Parcel, and her son Adrian. She is 65 and lives in Belmont, Kansas with her son. They have lived in Belmont for 2 years or so, and lived in Kingsman before that. This brief sighting occurred 2 days ago, 5/17/21, right around 6 p.m. Her son was driving her back home from a doctor's appointment in Wichita. She spotted the figure as they were crossing the bridge over the South Fork of a river. They both saw the figure briefly, but she got a better look at it. She estimates it was 150 feet away from the bridge. He estimates 200. It was on the north side of the bridge and west of the river. It was across from the small island visible. The location of the intersection signs is half a mile west of the bridge. She and her son both say the water level is higher today than it was 2 days ago. More of the Sandy Creek bank was visible then. The figure was standing on the riverbank, out from the tree line. It was only a few feet from the water. Right now, the spot where it was standing is completely underwater. She cannot guess the height of the figure, but both witnesses say it was a reddish brown and distinct from the green tree line behind it. She is certain it was covered with fur, and she says she could definitely see its arms and hands. The hands were darker in color than the body fur. She had heard about 2 other BFRO reports on or near the same area river over the past 20 years, so she would look for Sasquatches whenever driving through here. She thought she had seen a similar figure in roughly the same spot previously, but did not get a good look at it while passing the bridge. This time, she got a better look at it. There was nothing like a stump or debris in the area. The county road crossing this river is the type of back road in Kansas which may only see a few vehicles each day. Her son says that locals driving these roads do not drive faster than 50 because there are so many deer, it's unsafe to go any faster. This location seems like a prime spot to look for tracks, etc. It was dark at the time, and I was living on a road surrounded by woods. This was back in 2000, in the fall, in New Hampshire. I went out to take my dog for a walk. At the time, our driveway connected to a dirt road that ran up the side from the main road. We walked to the end of the dirt road, and along that road is a tree lining of woods. As we began heading back, I looked over and noticed a tall figure staring at me just at the edge of the woods. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was definitely taller than 7 feet, standing erect on 2 legs. I also noted that it had orange eyes. I started walking back down the road towards my house, and when I would stop, it would stop and look at me. I would walk some more. So would the thing. And then, once I stopped, it would stop. Now I was really freaked out, so I yelled for my dog to run, and we sprinted towards the house. That's when I finally got inside. I looked down our driveway and across the road at the tree line. The figure was still there staring at me. I told my father, but when he looked, he saw nothing. It must have left by then. A follow-up investigation report was done by BFRO investigator Matthew Moneymaker. I spoke with the witness, Michelle Goodwin, by phone. She was a teenager at the time of this incident. She no longer lives in the house mentioned in the report. She says the area now has many more houses than back in 2000. Tanglewood Road has been extended as well. She said the figure was a silhouette, but definitely not a bear. It was simply too tall and walked on 2 legs the entire time that it paralleled her. It was not more than 5 to 6 feet into the woods from side of the road. I asked about the eyes and whether they appeared to be glowing or just reflecting light. She said the eyes seemed to be glowing dimly, which is a common feature of many nighttime encounters. The color was somewhere between orange and yellow. Although she became more frightened as the stalking continued. She said the figure was not otherwise aggressive or hostile. She knew very little about the Sasquatch Bigfoot subject at the time. It was only many years later that she learned more and realized the figure that paralleled her in the night was likely one of these creatures, by process of elimination. Alright, here we go. I have had several encounters, so here's the first one. I was walking with two friends, looking for one of the friend's brother, walking down the abandoned Lake Champlain and Moria Railroad track bed. It was approximately 1:30 a.m., June 25th, 1989. That's when we heard a god-awful screaming noise coming from over the bank on the south side of the old rail bed. Metal was being ripped and thrown. Over the bank, there were a series of junked-out cars, some Subarus and an early 60s Chevy station wagon. One of my friends uttered the obligatory, "What was that?" and the noises ceased, almost like it hurt us. The next thing we heard was the sound of something very large breaking through the heavy brush of the woods right below us. Before we knew it, it was up the bank and standing in front of us. In the dark, I could not see it, but I could tell that it was huge. There was a smell, as well, almost like crossing a dead skunk and a deep bog. Nasty. My buddies took off, leaving me, because I was slow to react. I was scared, but sort of curious. The thing, whatever it was right in front of me. I could feel its breath, hear it breathing. I was only there for a second or two and then started running. The thing took off after us. I could hear its feet on the gravel behind me. It stopped chasing us just as we broke out on the road and headed up the main street. I chanced to look back, and I could see its shadow just inside the brush. I'll tell you this, whatever it was big. A lot bigger than a man, and I have never seen a bear move like that. The bank it climbed was over a 45-degree angle, loose gravel and stone, covered with vines and heavy brush. We tried climbing it the next weekend, and it took the best of us over 5 minutes to climb. At the time, we never bothered to look for tracks, but one interesting note that I stated above is that there were junked cars on the south side of the railbed, one of these being an early 60s station wagon, a big, heavy car. My friends and I had been in that area the week or so before, and the car had been on its wheels. The weekend after the occurrence, the car was on its roof, pieces ripped from it and scattered around. That really scared me, and I haven't been back since. The second encounter I had, that was just as strange as the first. Me and a buddy of mine were cruising in his 85 LTD station wagon, as the ultimate touring vessel, as it were, just out of enjoying the late summer September weather. It was a beautiful September night, the 23rd, 1993. We drove up this four-wheel drive tail to the point where everybody parties. Every hick town is one, and the trail heads for Westport, New York. He wheeled the car around and parked with the rear facing the woods, the nose facing down the road that we just came in on. We were just talking about the town, friends, plans, just stuff. I happened to look out the back, and I could see something coming up behind the car. The LTD wagon had huge taillights, and there was no guard over the license plate light, so the back of the car lit the area up pretty nicely. This thing was big, black, and had its arm out like it was going to open the door on the driver's side. The part that scared me the most was the fact that the rear hatch of the wagon did not latch. It kind of just moved around, thumped and when you hit a bump, that sort of thing. It was one of those things Matt was always going to fix, but you know how us men are. Never did. Anyway, I looked at Matt and asked, "Did you lock the doors?" calmly, almost deadpan. Something's about to open the door. Matt slammed the gear shift into drive and we took off out of there. I looked back and the thing stood up. It easily had to be over 7 feet tall. I mean, we're talking huge. Its eyes must have caught the taillight's glow because there was a red flicker in them. We never stopped until we got down to Port Henry, which is about 6 or 7 miles away. I live in a rural part of New York, just outside the blue line. I know what bears look like. I know how they behave. Each one of these encounters was no bear. I still don't know what to call each of them. It seems to fit the Sasquatch theory. But why in the middle of nowhere? Where I live, they already had the tourist hook. Lake Champlain. Each year, people with out-of-state plates flood the little town looking for the elusive critter. It's been almost 10 years since my first encounter and a scant 5 since my last. I'll tell you what, though. I still have no idea what exactly chased out of the woods we played in. The first encounter, though, we just had left Richie's house, went out looking for his brother. We were looking for his brother because he had gotten in a fight. He had arrived home just after we went out looking for him, though. We were also all very sober. For the second encounter, Matt and I were driving around, just cruising, looking for something, anything to do. Sober again at that point, as I want to make mention, I don't drink or do drugs. In August of 1996, myself and 6 friends were camping at Pine Pond in the lower Saranac Lake region. It was around dusk, and my friend and I were fishing in our canoe. The other members of our party were at camp preparing supper, about a quarter-mile away through the forest from our location on the canoe in the middle of the lake. My friend and I were speaking openly, not attempting to be quiet in any way. I was scanning the northern bank of the lake, which I knew quite well. That's when I noticed a strange shape on the edge of the woodline. It was about 50 yards away. Immediately, I pointed it out to my friend and he spotted it instantly. The shape was 3.5 feet off the ground at its highest point. At first, we both thought it was a black bear standing broadside, but after a few seconds, I realized that was not the case. We started to row towards it, somewhat cautiously. Just as my friend whispered, "It's a bear," the thing stood up. It had been crouching there on its feet, like a catcher from a baseball team. This thing, what we thought was a bear, had to have easily been 7 feet tall, and was very dark brown in color. Its face was hairy, yet fleshy around the upper cheeks. Its eyes were both dark in color, but clearly visible, and had a brightness about them. Upon talking afterwards, we both agreed that what we saw, the movements of its head and hands, it stood there for what seemed like 10 seconds looking at us. It tilted its head slightly, as if it were sniffing the air. As if this all wasn't strange enough, we then heard the snapping twigs about 50 feet behind it. The creature turned its torso to the left, looked to its side. Then, it immediately turned back towards us, then spun 180 degrees around, darting into the woods like a cat. We heard the sound of movement for about 10 more seconds. Lastly, nothing. To this day, I'm unsure what made those noises. After staying put in the canoe for about 10 minutes, my friend decided, against my wishes, to paddle to the spot on shore and investigate for tracks. There were only 2 discernible markings in the sand, which were obscured from pivoting its feet when it turned around. The whole experience was very, very upsetting, although I can honestly say it did not attempt to threaten us in any way. It was scary. That night, I did not sleep 1 wink. I was so focused on every little noise that I heard. And the next day, we left. The other people in our party are convinced we saw a bear, but I'm telling you, it was no bear. A follow-up investigation report was done by BFRO investigator Paul Mateja. The witness and a friend were in a canoe fishing when they saw a dark object approximately 50 yards away along the northwest shoreline of Pine Pond. They thought it was a bear and began to row towards it. When they had closed the distance to about 40 feet, this creature stood up. Immediately realizing this was not a bear, they stopped rowing and paddled backwards. They observed it for about 25 more seconds. However, details of the creature's appearance were rather vague because it was standing in the shadows and light levels were low at that point in the day. The report states it was about 7 feet tall, but in retrospect, the witness believes it was a little less than that. It was very similar in size and moved in a fashion similar to the creature seen in the Patterson film. The witness is not sure what was making the noise behind the creature. It did not seem alarmed at all by the noise, but rather seemed to know what it was, and it was at this point it turned and left. Pine Pond is about 10 miles from Lake Placid, host of 1932 and 1980 Winter Olympic Games. I didn't have an encounter exactly, but we are the owners of a camp in a remote region of the Adirondack Mountains. The camp is only accessible by hiking to it. There rarely is ever anybody around our camp. We have found strange things that have occurred. The first, in fall of 2002, we went hiking for the day. When we get back, and we found a small pile of rocks at the back door. They were neatly stacked with a stick coming out of them. These rocks were not there when we left. They appeared to be deliberately stacked. We understand that these could not have been easily made by a human, but there's never anybody around up there. The fall of 2003. One night, around 7:30 p.m., dark, my wife and I went outside with 2 dogs. We smelled something very strong and musty, like nothing we smelt before. It wasn't the dogs or anything we could remotely identify. The 2 dogs got very antsy and begged to go inside right away. This was very strange and freaky. Now, these dogs are generally not scared dogs. They also are large dogs, about 80 pounds each. We had never seen them act this way, ever. When we bring them out at night or day, they run all over the woods. And this night, they wanted nothing to do with that. Almost like they smelled something that scared them. Number 3. The same exact thing happened. I went outside around 9:30 p.m. to relieve myself. While I was doing that, I hear a large heavy stomping behind me. The stomping was loud and heavy, as if something was fleeing. But the strange part is it sounded like it made 4 to 5 bounds, then stopping. I heard nothing else after that. I looked around a little bit, but the happenings of this night made me uneasy. So I went inside and locked up the cabin. I don't know what did all this, and maybe it's easily explained away, but these things altogether make me think it might have been a Bigfoot. A follow-up investigation report was done. I spoke with the witness by phone on 12/22/05. The witness recounted the set of unusual occurrences in amazing detail. The remote cabin where the events took place has been in the family for over 70 years, and the witness's family typically stays there for a weekend or 2, at least once every fall. The cabin has no running water or electricity and requires a half-mile hike from the nearest road. Now, the first event took place in the late afternoon when the witness, his wife, and 2 young children and 3 adult relatives returned to the cabin after a day-long hike in the adjacent area. Nothing unusual took place during the hike, but upon returning to the cabin, the group observed a small rock pile and stick formation on the back porch steps. There were a total of 3 rocks, which the witness described as being relatively flat and smooth, and about the size of an adult hand. He reported that similar stones are found in abundance and scattered all throughout the immediate cabin area. No other events took place the remainder of the weekend. Approximately 1 year later, the family of 4 and 2 adult relatives was at the cabin for yet another October weekend retreat. In the early evening, the witness and his wife went out to the back porch of the cabin with their 2 family dogs. They both immediately smelt an unusual, strong, musky odor that the very witness described as a wet dog smell. They smelt their dogs and ruled out the odor as coming from them. Nothing further happened, and the couple decided to play it safe by going back inside after a few moments. Now, approximately 2 hours go by, and the witness went out the front door of the cabin, walked about 25 feet to the edge of the tree line. While standing there, the witness heard a very loud stomping sound, but it only lasted for a few seconds. But it shook the ground around him. The witness turned toward the sound, which he estimated to be coming from the base of a hillside, about 25 yards away. As soon as the witness turned, the sound ceased. The witness mentioned that although it was a windy night, the sound did not seem to be a falling tree branch. No vocalizations or strange smells were observed in that moment. No further events have taken place for the remainder of the family's stay. The witness mentioned seeing tree scrappings in an area about 6 feet off the ground, and that bear and deer are known to inhabit the area. The witness also mentioned an abundance of wild blueberry and blackberry bushes in the area that bear fruit in August and September. The witness and his immediate family have not been back to the cabin since 2003. These occurrences took place near Keene Valley, New York, within the Adirondack Park Reserve. The cabin is actually located near the Phelps Brook High Wilderness area, a recognized ancient forest area with a top elevation of 3,700 feet, comprised of balsam fir, red spruce, and mountain paper birch. Also nearby is the Marcy Swamp, also an ancient forest area. Vocalizations and sightings have been previously reported in the entire general area, central Essex County. On June 10th, 2006, I was driving with my brother on a back road, unpaved, in the Adirondack Park. We were heading for a trailhead that led into the Hudson River Gorge. This area is almost dead center in the park and surrounded by many miles of uninhabited and very rugged terrain. It was late morning on a clear day. I was driving as fast as I could on this road because we had to get back to town by a certain time. As we turned a bend, I see a very large brown, furry object lunging into the dense woods up the road at the next curve, maybe 50 yards ahead. It was obvious that the creature was in the road and was startled by my speeding SUV. I told my brother, "Hey, there goes a moose." We reached the spot in about 3 seconds, and I slam on my brakes, expecting to see the moose right there in the bushes. At that spot, though, through the bushes, was a decent-sized clearing, and then more dark woods that went down a hill. As we looked, there was nothing at all. Everything was still. We started off again and took our hike. The more I thought about it, though, the more I thought it couldn't have just been a moose. First of all, it was the wrong color, a light chestnut brown. The color was very visible because the sun was shining in the area. It was a striking shade against the light green of the brush, and moose are never that shade. They are always a dark brown. Second, the size and shape were wrong. This thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and the shape was not like a moose rump. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like it was the upper back and head of something. Finally, if it was a moose, it would have not utterly vanished so quickly. My vehicle got to that spot in just seconds. Moose, at least the ones that I have seen, don't tear off into the woods. We should have seen it in the clearing. It wasn't a bear either, not even close. I wished I had stopped to investigate further. Unfortunately, we were in a hurry. Did I mention this location is in the middle of a large wilderness? There are practically no roads or trails at all in the entire area. In fact, some sections of the forest here are completely impassable due to very steep, overgrown terrain. A follow-up investigation report was done by BFRO investigator Paul Conroy. After an extensive phone interview, the witness provided the following details. The sighting lasted approximately 3 seconds, using the trees at the location that the creature stood as base. The witness estimated the animal at 7.5 feet tall and having a color described as chestnut or light brown. As this thing moved away, the witness observed the shoulders and head of the animal. The witness owns a house in the area and is very familiar with native wildlife. The color description and details provided by the witness regarding how the creature moved seems to rule out a bear. While there are moose in the area, they generally do not move in the smooth and quick manner that was described. When they are disturbed by human activity, they commonly walk away slowly. This area is also in the vicinity of the Hudson River Gorge, a part of the Adirondack Mountains, known for clean, fast-moving water sources, abundant wildlife, and dense forest and vegetation with a lot of small cliffs and peaks. This is my Bigfoot sighting. This was in early August of 2010, approximately around 8 to 8:30 a.m., right on the Cascade Lakes, New York, near Keene, and the weather was clear, with only a few clouds. I spend most of the summers camping in and around the Adirondacks in my Dodge Caravan. This particular summer, I had stopped at Cascade Lake to spend a few days camping. I had slept soundly the previous night and had woken up around 7 a.m. I decided to get up and start making my breakfast. I had just started the kettle on the camp stove when I looked over at the upper Cascade Lake and I could see the mist rising off the surface of the lake. I grabbed my iPhone and walked about 50 yards to the edge of the lake to get a picture. As I approached the break wall, that's when I noticed a dark brown object on the opposite side of the lake at the shoreline. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but it seemed to be sitting at the water's edge. I then quickly realized it must have been a bear. The animal looked like it was doing something in the water with its paws, as I could hear a faint splashing sound. I thought it would be a good idea to get a picture, so I brought my iPhone up to my face level, tried to focus in on the animal. As I was focusing in, the animal stood up on 2 legs. I was startled and pulled down my phone to see this with my own eyes. It took a step towards the tree line and stopped, almost methodically. As it stopped, it turned its entire upper body to the left, staring at me for a couple of seconds. It turned back and in one step, disappeared into the tree line. I immediately went cold and got scared. As I ran back to my campsite, my only thought was that it was going to go left or right. If it went right, it would have to go into the water, and if it went left, it was headed directly for my campsite. I decided that it was best to get the hell out of Dodge. I arrived back at my campsite in just under a minute. My dog was still asleep on the front seat and did not even stir. I opened the passenger side door of my van and began to throw all my camping gear into the back of the van, making quite a mess. I closed the door, jumped into the driver's side, and floored the gas to leave. As I'm driving out, I kept looking out my left driver's side window to see if I can observe any possibility of seeing it, but I saw nothing. I drove all the way into Lake Placid, parked at a mall parking lot to try and gather my thoughts and think about what had taken place. It's easy to say that I was shaken up, and I kept replaying that experience over and over in my head, just trying to understand and make sense of what I had seen. Here are my observations. I could not ascertain its height exactly, due to the distance, but I would guess that it was approximately 7 to 8 feet tall, covered head to toe in shaggy, dark brown hair or fur. I could see the sunlight shining off its back as it turned to go into the tree line, and could see the brown coloration as it turned away from me. When it turned to stare at me, I could not make out any facial features, but I knew that it saw me. The upper body was massive and stocky like a football player's build was. It had very long arms and went well below its waist. I could also make out what I assume were the shape of hands. It walked upright and paused before slowly turning its upper body to look directly at me. It stared at me for approximately 5 to 10 seconds and turned back to face the tree line. It took about 1 to 2 more steps, then finally disappearing into the forest. I could see a couple of branches move after it went into the trees. It was then I decided to leave. I did not hear anything other than the initial splashing it made in the water with its hands when I first thought it was a bear. I did not return to the area until 3 years later with a friend to camp. Nothing has happened on subsequent trips to the area of Cascade Lake. I have had 2 other odd experiences in other areas of the 80 Ks on other trips though. June 5th, 2018. This is the date that I saw a strange creature. I simply can't quite identify what it was. I'd like to start by saying that I'm a very skeptical person, but can also be quite open-minded. So, I would like for this not to be taken as a joke or something of the sort. To start off, I sent my friend out to his truck for gas and snacks at roughly 11 p.m. on this day. I was extremely tired and wanted to pass out. I figured getting snacks was a good way to do so. Only problem, I cannot fall asleep. Shortly after he left, a loud thumping noise began coming from the outside of my house, which very much so startled me. Since my family lived in the country, we always had critters and other animals outside. I wasn't too sure what it could have been. I jumped up to look outside my window. It was dark, but I could not see much. And then I see this pale figure out in the distance. It was very large in size and looked dark, but pale at the same time. I can only describe it as being very tall, with somewhat of a weird round shape to it. I watched this figure for about 30 seconds, during which time it seemed to be looking around for something before running on 2 legs towards my house. I panicked. This thing was larger than any man I'd ever seen, and did I mention it was large? I quickly ducked down under my window, hoping it had not seen me. I peeked back up a few seconds later and saw that it was on my porch. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but my phone refused to focus on this thing. It was strange looking, tall, and very pale white. It had a very bizarre looking head and kept making these strange noises. This creature, whatever it was, began slowly walking around my house. It had a very strange gait, like it was drunk or something. It walked very close to the house and occasionally would stop to look into the windows. I stayed silent, hoping this thing would not see me. I hid at just the right spot, so it never saw me, but I saw it, and I'll never forget its face. It reminded me of how a goblin would look. After looking around for a few minutes, this being seemed to just disappear. I wasn't sure if it had left, so I stayed quiet and hid even longer. When I finally made myself move, I went to my car and grabbed my gun. I live in New Mexico, so we're allowed to carry guns. After walking outside with the gun in tow, I didn't see anything. I figured it had just left. I mean, I hadn't heard any noises for a while, so I decided to go back inside. After getting up the courage to enter my own house, I went in and took some time to think about what happened. After sitting around for a whole 15 minutes, thinking about what all took place, I just looked outside again to see if whatever that thing was could still be around. I heard a noise coming from outside, but it was actually my friend pulling back up from the store. He comes in and told me about what he had seen. I had seen the same thing. I guess he saw it while coming back, and he didn't think I was completely crazy or just seeing things. I explained to him that this was not a person or any animal I have ever seen. We don't know what it was, but there's no way that it was anything human. Like I said, I'm very skeptical and open-minded, but this was something else entirely. This happened on a very sunny morning, out on the water with the sun's beautiful rays beaming down. I reflected upon how little we know about this world and how much more there is to discover. It makes me wonder if this creature had anything to do with my thoughts that day. As I rode across the lake surrounded by lush trees, I just felt alone in the world. My dog, who was lying down near my feet, began to act strangely and seemed on high alert. Then I saw it. A singular creature ran past me at full speed and was gone before I could even comprehend what had just happened. In that brief moment, I witnessed an upright animal that stood on its hind legs, almost like a human, only with grayish-brown fur all over, except for its face, which seemed to be white or gray in color. Whatever creature this was ran just inside the tree line of the right where I was at, and my dog was now going crazy. Then this thing sticks its head out of the trees and looks directly at me. I could see long pointy ears, glowing red eyes, a snout similar to an elk or moose, and a tan head. It was not like any animal I had ever seen before. However, what startled me the most was that it seemed to have facial features of a human being, like a short, stocky man. It stood about 6 feet tall from what I could make out of its body, while it was crouched down by the tree line with its head sticking out at me. It appeared canine looking, but very human-like as well. I, scared completely out of my wits. This thing lets out this small grin on its face, like it had just found prey that it was going to devour. It's like we had just encountered some sort of freak werewolf creature, or something. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. I turned my boat around and began rowing as fast as I could, with the creature still staring at me from the shoreline. Once I was far enough away from these woods, which seemed to be full of a mysterious presence that day, I noticed how strange it was that this thing did not go out into the water to pursue us. In fact, when I turned around to see it, if it was still there, it was actually gone. As I rowed back to the dock, my dog, who was sitting near me when all this occurred, appeared traumatized by what she had seen. She would not even look at the water or even go near it again for several days after that. We have never seen anything like it before or since, and I don't think we ever will. I live in the woods of upstate New York. Used to stay in a small cabin on the bank of a small creek. I heard a strange noise outside and went to investigate. I looked up and saw a very strange creature flying over the creek. Honestly, I thought it was a person with wings at first, but I'm not sure that the height of it was from my perspective. The span of its wings looked to be about the size of a full-grown man. It appeared to have very broad shoulders, long arms, similar like that of an ape, yet it had a very human-like face. It appeared to have fur, or fur-like feathers, covering its body, and was dark brown in color. It flew over the creek and disappeared off into the trees. I have never heard or seen anything like this before, and I thought I should share my story with you. I tried doing some research and looking into what this could have possibly been, but I'm not too sure. It definitely was not a bird, and I don't believe it was like a dinosaur or anything. Either due to the fact that he didn't flap his wings once when flying, it appeared to glide at a constant speed and direction without flapping its wings and was moving fairly quickly. There are stories all over the world of a man-bird and man-bat type creature, but none of them are as well established in local folklore as that of the birdman. There's a county in northern Michigan, Delta County I believe, where for years reports have been made of a creature with a man's body and an eagle's head. This beast has been seen along Lake Superior for generations, along with the infamous canine cryptid known as the Michigan Dogman. Then, there's the possibility it was what's known as a bat squatch, judging by its appearance. As far as I'm aware of, bat squatches are unknown, and there have been few to little reports of them. I'm not sure what it was, but one thing is certain. Whatever it was not some sort of ordinary bird or animal. Even the Chippewa Indians had their own tales of large flying hairy creatures that would swoop down and abduct lone wanderers from the villages. The Thunderbird, of course, is a mythical creature with roots in many northern Native American tribes, and has been described as this enormous bird with great wings outstretched. A very large creature that would attack people and take them away, never to be seen again. It can't be a coincidence that this description fits the Thunderbird, Mothman, or Bat Squatch. But while there seem to be many flying cryptid descriptions and sightings, none of them 100% quite fit exactly what was seen that day. I was driving through New Mexico later on in the evening. It was around 11 p.m. because the sun had already gone down. I was driving through a remote area on a long straight road that stretched for miles and miles ahead of me. The road's shoulder was narrow, and there weren't any cars on the road, so it was safe to go at normal speeds of 55 to 60 miles an hour. Suddenly, on my left and slightly ahead of me, I saw a coyote standing in the middle of the road. But this wasn't any normal coyote. It was an upright, walking coyote with a strange face that had only one eye. I slowed down to around 40 miles an hour when I saw it, then braked when I got close. As I passed it, however, the coyote quickly shot across the road and stood on the other side. Then, it continued to stare at me as I passed, then turned around and ran off into the desert shrub that grew alongside the road. It left such a strong impression on my mind that even today, I still remember it vividly. I also had my windows rolled down and a foul odor lingered behind. I can't describe it. It just stunk badly. There were many types of werewolf sightings. Some people report seeing full-fledged werewolves, while others say they saw a strange person that transformed into a wolf. There are even those who claim to have seen half-human creatures called were hybrids. As for me, I'd like to talk about something different from all the other reports out there. In my opinion, a werewolf is actually a wolf or the spirit of a wolf that possesses the body of a human. The Native American Indians have many legends about these werewolves. Sometimes they are referred to as Skinwalkers, a person who could shapeshift into an animal at will and who uses the ability to help mankind, or for evil. According to one legend, the human body is nothing more than a tool that allows man to possess many things, such as looks. It's possible that it is also a tool for possessing animal characteristics in order to be able to fulfill special tasks. These legends and stories about werewolves have been passed down from generation to generation among many Native Americans. But many of these stories are also present in other cultures all around the world and go back centuries. However, while I don't necessarily believe that what I saw was exactly a werewolf by any stretch of the means, I believe it could have been a skinwalker of some kind, based on its appearance and how it seemed to not want to have been seen. I've thought for years about how that coyote creature was a strange thing. Coyotes are mostly active at night, so maybe what I saw was actually just a coyote. But what about it being upright and the strong odor it left behind? I can't quite figure out why, who or what, but something was up. I'm one of those teenagers that really likes to party. My story takes me back to when I was 15, 3 years ago, in late October. Myself, my brother, and 2 other friends of ours were driving back home from a party here in the suburbs. It was raining pretty hard out, so we had to drive around 5 miles an hour. It's not often we got rain that limited visibility, as badly as snow does. Most of us were in a love-hate relationship with the anxiety over the possibility of blindly striking a vehicle or being struck by one. I guess it was the closest thing to being forced into a game of chicken. We finally got into the parkway that surrounds the woods. Visibility was absolutely ridiculous, but fortunately, we were in my friend's SUV, so stopping on a dime wouldn't be a problem. I think all of us had a heart attack when something slammed into the side of the vehicle. It wasn't another car. It was a person. A girl who looked like she'd been out in the rain for days. It wasn't the sort of area that it was a good idea to pick up hitchhikers, but under the circumstances, we made an exception for this poor girl. She got into the back seat with me and my brother. Right away, I knew something was wrong. The most awful smell I'd ever smelt in my life filled the cab of the SUV. I would have thought that any length of time in the rain like that would have been a little bit like a stink, at least washing the stink off, if that makes sense. This wasn't just bad body odor. This stunk of rot, mold, and death. That was the very first time in my life that I had ever come close to vomiting, just by the smell of something. I also became aware of the sound of wheezing, the sort of sound you would expect to hear from somebody dying of pneumonia in a hospital bed. Somebody else must have been thinking the same thing. Our friend that was driving asked the girl if she needed to go to the hospital. She replied that she would just get off when we were closer to wherever we were going. Now, my friend warned her that where we were headed was pretty much in the middle of nowhere, but she assured us this was fine. I quietly thanked God that I had my brother between me and her, because I don't think I could have held the contents of my stomach if I were sitting right next to her. I nervously kept stealing glances at her. Her skin wasn't healthy. The circles around her eyes were so dark, I thought they were bruises. And the same sickly black and purplish color was also on her lips. The strangest thing happened after a few moments. I began to get a very, very hungry feeling. In spite of the awful stink that I was shacked up with, my stomach began rumbling. I was afraid that the bad smell would make me want to vomit, but instead, I only felt hungrier. As if things couldn't get any more bizarre, our friend that was driving suddenly let go of the wheel to attack our other friend in the passenger seat. My mind flashed through the events of the evening, looking for any trace of a reason why they would be upset with each other. But it was in the flash of lights of an oncoming car that I saw that the driver was using his teeth to bite. Our car was beginning to drift into the oncoming lane. So, as the fight in the front began to center over in the passenger seat, I made a mad grab for the steering wheel after I got my seatbelt off. The whole thing was just about as graceful as you would imagine. the car lurching off the road where it rolled several times, and miraculously enough, landed upright. My left elbow was screaming. I was pretty sure it was broken. I also think that I lost consciousness for several seconds. When I looked around, the only person in the SUV was me and my brother, yelling about something. Through blurred vision and clouded hearing, with the sound of the pouring rain beating against the twisted roof of the SUV, I saw the strange girl and our driver attacking our friend that had been in the passenger seat. He was trying to run away, and they were tracking him, tackling him down, clinging to him. My mind raced as to what I could possibly do. Directly behind me, in the furthest part of the SUV, was a tire iron. I only had one arm at that point, so I first opened my door, grabbing the tire iron, painfully negotiated my way out the SUV. The adrenaline and the agony of my broken elbow teamed up to make time feel like it was passing in slow motion. Well, for a few seconds, I had some doubts about what I was going to do. Those doubts evaporated when I could see the rain washing what looked like blood down this girl's face, as her jaw seemed locked on our friend. I brought the tire iron down on her. She didn't let go right away. I shook off the shock and I struck a second time, and a third, and a fourth. Like an overgrown tick, she finally let go when there wasn't much left of her head. When she disengaged, our driver disengaged as well. My brother must have gotten a hold of either his phone or mine, because an ambulance and police showed up just a few moments after. The investigation dragged on a lot longer than it should have. There was no evidence of our strange hitchhiker. There was all the evidence in the world of our driver attacking the passenger. But despite me and my brother telling the same story, our account was viewed with suspicion. I think the only reason we aren't in jail right now is because the story of the driver and the passenger didn't implicate us. The driver is not in prison, but he is in a mental health facility. I've tried to go to see him several times, but for some reason, he was not allowed to see anybody at all. When I asked how he's doing, I didn't get any kind of answer, neither good or bad. Now, I've told this story a few times, but I can only count on one hand just how many times I have. It usually involved alcohol. I lucked out a little bit, told the story in front of an associate who was also a very strong Native American. He told me about some creature called a Wendigo that's supposed to be more evil spirit than monster. He summarized that they probably weren't allowing my friend any visitors, that they would be in a state but defied explanation. They probably didn't want any media attention. It sounds like a bad plot to a horror movie, but if that's true, then I can't imagine what sort of condition my friend is in, or if he'll ever come out of it. I know this sounds incredibly far-fetched, but I don't know who else to turn to. I don't know who else to tell my story to, so I'm hoping it'll at least be read by you. Thank you. When I went camping years back, I saw the one thing that changed my mind about there being any kind of beauty or serenity in nature. I no longer see the trees, I see the shadows. I no longer hear the birds. I only hear the wolves and any sounds of snapping twigs. It was me and several friends. We chose to camp next to a creek. It would be the easiest way to find our way back to civilization. So we just followed the creek out until we found a satisfactory spot. And then, when we were done, we would follow it back. We had a pretty good fire going. It was at that level of intoxication where I was trying to make torches out of whatever I could find on the forest floor. I wasn't doing a bad job. I turned around to see a shape coming up out of the creek, and at first, I thought that one of my friends had slipped into the water, which would have been nuts considering how cold the night was. As this shape continued to emerge out of the water, I could then see the murky water pouring out of the holes in its chest, and its mouth hanging wide open. The skin of the cheeks being papery, stretched so thin, I thought they would tear. The body was like a very tall person's, but the head was like somebody tried to take a human head and sculpt it into a deer's. Long nose, jaws, and antlers. And the most horrible smell in the world wafted over to me. It was like breathing pure airborne disease. The thing began to lumber towards me, and I scrambled out of its way, got close to the fire. My words were slurred, and in my panic, I wasn't able to say much more than a mush. My friends looked at me like I was doing acid, and a ghoulish howl from the monster as it began to come within the edge of the light. I stopped jabbering and pointed. This close to my friends, it dwarfed all of us, standing at least a good 7 feet tall. I somehow found it within myself to take one of my redneck torches and begin waving it, the fire, in front of the monster's face. It swatted it at me like it was a mosquito, but it definitely did not like the fire. One of my friends got the hint, poured our lighter fluid on the ground by squeezing it into a jet. The flames carved a path to the monster's feet, and it danced to avoid them. But it was too late. The legs kindled surprisingly well, and the thing retreated. We could tell that we were living on borrowed time, so we grabbed our bare essentials and left. We eventually went back for the rest of our things, but it took us quite some time. This was a creature that completely terrified me. I was about 8 years old. My family had gone to North Florida for a vacation. We were staying in a small cabin that sat on Lake Seminole, and the surrounding area was all wilderness. It was pitch black outside, except for some light from the full moon overhead, when I heard a big thud on the front porch. I thought there might be an alligator on the porch or something. I was eager for a look, but none of the windows on the porch were just straight glass. They were all ornate and colored and carved into complicated geometric facets. A voice that sounded eerily like my mother's asked me to open the door. I was almost sure that my parents were in their bedroom for the night, but I was a kid and curious. I wasn't entirely stupid. I snuck out the back door, peeking around the corner of the front porch. I don't know how I managed to surpass my scream, but what I saw standing at the front door was not my mother. It wasn't even human. I looked, and it just seemed like time seemed to elude it. Its lipless mouth asked me if I was still there, and it said that Mommy didn't want to wait forever outside. It looked like a freshly exhumed mummy, minus the wrappings. It had black and broken antlers jutting out of its skull. The very sight of it made my heart stop. I ran back inside as quietly as I could, and in my terror, I thought it had picked up on my presence and began to pursue me. I guess I didn't know what I was in for. But I was inside before it could get me. I hid in my bedroom, ignoring the knocks that persisted. For some reason, my parents never answered. I'm writing this from Atlanta, Georgia. Myself and my mother had a very unusual experience last February 2020, right before COVID hit. We were going wedding dress shopping in a town nearby. It was a cool day, the perfect temperature for a girl's day out, despite it being in winter. We had a full day planned. Champagne, cocktails, lots of treats. But something happened that has compelled me to put pen to paper, so to speak, to make sense of something gruesome and deadly that tarnished what should have been one of the best days I've had. I just tried on my wedding dress and had it all picked out. My mother and I were leaving the shop feeling blissful. Everything was working out. That's when we noticed this awful burning smell, like sulfur. It was a cold day, so the smell was very out of place and very unusual. When we looked behind us, we saw nothing, so we kept on walking. However, when we got to the car, we both noticed the smell had gotten much worse. I checked to see my tires and everything all seemed fine. The next thing I heard was my mother screaming. She grabbed onto me. Behind us was a terrifying creature, such that I had never seen before. It was serpentine in appearance, maybe about 8 feet long. But instead of the unusual patterned snake, which I was accustomed to seeing, this thing was red, like it had been skinned. It was repulsive. In addition to that, this thing had long protrusions sticking out of its head. It appeared to have multiple sets of teeth or fang-like protrusions sticking out of its mouth. The creature was moving around in circles around the parking lot, coming out of the nearby woods, apparently stopping and smelling the ground. The next thing I heard, my mother was retching behind the car, wailing, evidently horrified by the sight. I dropped my dress on the ground, and Beast slithered up right next to it. It moved the dress, leaving a stain. Eventually, I don't know if this was a snake or what, but I'll call it a snake for the continuity of the story. It left us both dumbfounded, confused, and completely terrified. We got into the car immediately, calling the cops. They got there and the cop was drinking coffee, asked if we had smoked any weed. He was definitely a very staunch individual, blamed it all on the weed, even though we hadn't had any and didn't even smoke. We told him we had saw this thing and felt lucky to be alive. We were both terrified for anyone else who came across it. Especially right around where it went back into in the woods was this patch of field where there were more houses. We both felt like this thing could be a danger if anybody else ran into it. I even showed him my wedding dress and the blood mark, but he just dismissed it. Needless to say, we went home deeply agitated and distressed. Obviously, I didn't wear that dress and couldn't get my money back either, as it was badly damaged. I burned it, hoping that the ritual would burn the memory right out of my head. But it didn't, and it hasn't. I know it's probably extreme of me to do that, but this sighting affected me. The creature and the experience still very much haunt my memory to this day, and I often have nightmares of visions of it sleeping in wake hours. It's unbearable. I'm also carrying a child now, and have no idea how traumatic this memory is, how it could be affecting my unborn child. The only thing I know of that I've heard is that the smell of sulfur is often accompanied with the sighting of demons. Did I see a real-life demon? I don't know. But I beg you, if you have any information on what this creature is or has been, please get in touch. I'm putting together a strong case and submitting it. I hope that this matter will be investigated thoroughly, and maybe will be solved eventually. Anyway, I still have sleepless nights and often feel overwhelmed by the sheer memory. I hope I can one day heal and get better. I do not want to live in a world where such creatures exist and haunt my memory. For the sake of my child, I will fight this creature until it is found. I beg anyone who reads this and encounters something similar to come forward. It was 1972, and I was on a field trip with some fellow classmates. Being only 18 then, and thought I knew everything. This was in Denver, Colorado. A lot of forestry. Plenty of room to do whatever we wanted. At night, when the teachers and the rest of everybody else was asleep, a few of us seniors would go to a quiet space and smoke weed. On this one night, it was just me and my friend Margaret and her boyfriend. We were talking about the latest music, and at the time, glam rock was just a booming thing. It was an exciting time to be young. Style was everything, and expressing who you were individually was an art, more so than today. No longer did we feel the need to be shamed or be like everybody else. Well, as it happens on this one night, we saw something very strange in the woods. We were walking, I would say briskly, back to the camp after our hash, when we saw what appeared to be a scarecrow hanging from the trees above us. It was pretty freaky, and might I add, disturbing. It was around the same time the Manson family and I feared that some crazy commune or cult were going to jump out and attack. But we still kept still, just watching. It was dressed like a man and was most definitely a scarecrow. Its face, though, was painted like a clown, and it had the face of a clown that would visit a kid's birthday. That made the sight even more disturbing. I felt sick and grabbed Margaret and James, her boyfriend, tried to get them to go back to camp. They just stood transfixed. Something terrifying then happened. The creature moved its head down, stared down at us, with its clown-like face, smiled and laughed at us. It was a menacing, cold laugh, one that seemed to send hair on our bodies upward in shock and terror. We all screamed and were spooked. We went and ran, but when we did, we found we hit a dead end. The creature did a 360 turn and was now staring at us again, laughing. Now it began to turn into more of a shadow. We turned again and found ourselves at yet another dead end. This is it. We were going to die here, by this horror. I didn't know what to do or where to hide. There were no cell phones at the time anyway, so no teacher or parent or officer could ever be contacted. We felt so helpless. We kept running, and luckily this time made it to our camp, where everybody was fast asleep. Not sure if it was a bad trip or if we had actually seen what we saw. But in the morning, we all agreed that it was real, and we had seen something dreadful and horrific. We all agreed not to tell anybody, as they would either think we were drug-crazed or crazy, and we were all on the verge of going to college. We didn't need any bad rap. But that experience changed us. We could no longer be around each other. That memory of the incident was written across all of our faces. I truly believe we experienced something paranormal out in those woods. It's been nearly 50 years now, and I still can't look at a scarecrow or a clown to this day. Some things are just not the same anymore. I wonder if I was crazy or if this was a bad trip. But I hope one day I'll find answers, before I die, about what it was. Maybe, just maybe, it's still out there. I'm not sure I can ever forget that night, even though it was over 20 years ago. I was at college in Liverpool, England. I was walking home from my part-time job at the coffee shop. The night was still, and I felt so grateful to have a job that could make me self-sufficient and look after myself. No one was going to tell me otherwise. I mean, my job was awesome. I loved being a barista. As I was walking home, I went to call my then boyfriend to tell him to put on some dinner for me. Cell phones were pretty much just out, and my phone then was this huge clunky thing. Didn't have much battery or network. I wasn't surprised then when it didn't reach him, so I just shrugged it off and kept walking. My usual walk home was through residential streets. Usually, they were abuzz with activity as they were student housing. But on this night, all seemed deathly still. I remember laughing a bit, thinking it was some weird apocalypse movie. I thought of a joke to tell my boyfriend. I felt like a proper white girl in a horror movie walking home. Although I had gotten used to walking everywhere by myself, I wasn't freaked out or anything. As I turned to go on one of the roads, I realized it was closed as there had been some major cracks in the road's surface. I heard whispers of something odd happening during the night, and residents had awoke to a screeching, screaming sound, only to find a huge hole in the residential street. I remapped my route and just went an alternative one. This route was a little darker, so I decided to walk more briskly. When I was about halfway up this path, which I was surrounded by woodland and foliage. I heard something. Now, this something was whimpering, all the way to my right. I had a fear it was a child or dog, so I looked over instinctively. However, it was no child or dog, but rather something unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life. It was a creature, about the size of a dog, but with no fur or skin. Rather disgusting looking. Its legs were small and webbed, and it looked like it had no idea how to move. Then, to answer my questions, I see this large thing pulling out of its head, and as this thing moved along, it kind of moved all around. I know it's hard to explain, but it moved kind of like it glided. I had the impression it could even fly had it moved right. Its face was disturbing, kind of mashed in with dead skin, dark, large black eyes, and its mouth opened to reveal a lizardish mouth, small fangs, and large cave-like opening for food. I had watched enough nature documentaries to know the damage this creature could do with just a small amount of bite. Not taking my eyes away from this strange creature, eventually, I got away. I still remember this incident to this day and have never really forgotten it. I feel grateful to be alive and wonder what could have happened often. Not many people believed me when I told them about my experience. I know it's true. This was back in October of 2017. I saw some strange creatures. I was at my uncle's house in the backyard with my parents and a few cousins. My cousin had this spinning wheel thingy that you could either ride or push around. I got on it, and while going around, I heard some dogs barking in the distance. Not unusual, as there were Doberman pinschers in the dog pen nearby. But after a while of riding around, I started hearing something else too. Like an animal rustling through leaves or grass. The thing was getting closer to me, but all else remained quiet besides the animals outside. Suddenly, they stopped making noise, which made me freeze in my spot on the wheel for a second, before checking to see if anybody else noticed anything unusual. That was when I noticed I had ridden out of the yard and was a lot closer to the woods at the edge of the property than I had thought. I could still very visibly see the rest of the family, who all appeared to have not even seen that I wasn't right there. My dad and uncle were taking care of the grill. My aunt and mother busy setting up the table, and my cousins were just messing about with a Nerf gun. Even though I could have just yelled and they would have been able to hear me, their voices seemed really far away. I mean, even the dogs from down the street seemed far more quiet. I felt this weird urge to scream and run, but also like I was rooted to the spot, frozen and could not move, just stare into the tall grass that just moments before had been rustling, and now silent and still. I knew instinctively there was something there. The best way I can describe it, it would be like when you're underwater. That kind of muffled sound where you know stuff is going on around you, but you can't quite make it out. It sounded almost like there were low voices coming from the tall grass. We'd been warned not to play in that grass in this particular spot that leads into the woods behind my uncle's house, mainly because of snakes. But this did not sound like slithering or hissing. Then, the voice-like noise stopped, and there was more rustling again, like something sure as hell was moving in there. Thankfully, sounding like it was heading back into the trees, and not towards I. But I still just waited, feeling unable to move. To this day, I am unable to tell you exactly what emerged from that grass and crawled into the woods. There were two of them, both very similar in size. The best example of what they should have been, I guess, would be a deer. They looked like some sort of deer, but wrong. Deer gone wrong, horribly disfigured or mutated. That's literally the best way to describe what they were. And no, they moved like they weren't used to being on four legs. They acted uncomfortable, awkward, stilted and stunted. I thought maybe those were the injured or deformed. But in all honesty, they just looked wrong. As soon as they disappeared back into the woods, I felt like a release, and all of a sudden, all the sounds from around me came back clear, and I heard and saw my mother call and waving at me, and telling me the hot dogs were now ready, and to come wash up. I never told them at all what I saw, because frankly, I don't know. And also, they probably wouldn't believe me if I did. Just in case they had. I want to keep thinking I imagine it. It's really the only way I can sleep at night. But I have a feeling deep down what I saw is more real than everything around me. This was long before I knew what a skinwalker was. But one time when I was 17, I was walking home from high school when I just got this discernible feeling I was being watched by something, not someone. I looked around, following my instincts. I saw nothing but a bush moving out in the distance, as if something was hiding behind it. It had to be a skinwalker. And that same year, my grandmother had had a ton of encounters with these beings, and they were constantly following her around, which meant that I too was now a target for these same beings. I had gotten so used to seeing them, I wasn't just afraid, I was always afraid. Of course, the thing with skinwalkers is that unless you know about them, know what to look for, you never even knew they existed, which is the entire point. They can possess, if that is the right word, anyone or anything. I live in constant fear. I wish there was some sort of test, like you see in the movies with demons. You know, throwing holy water at them, and if they sizzle, you kinda know. But there is nothing like that for a skinwalker. And even if there was, I can't just walk about pouring holy water over people, just in case. I think you kinda understand. But I guess once you know what you're looking for, you can tell. It's often the giveaway is the eyes. The way they move, and it seems wrong. Especially if they are walking in animal form. Ever seen a dog that looked overly intelligent? A deer or coyote that didn't walk quite right, as if it wasn't used to being on four legs? How about a person in the street? Someone you've never seen before, and yet something seemed both off and yet familiar. Despite never having laid eyes on them before, they seem to turn up several times throughout your day, and yet you may have traveled miles. I've had all of those things. One of the worst and most terrifying experiences was when I was followed for almost an entire day by what I am sure was one person using many different people to walk in. How could I tell? How did I know that somebody else was using all these different people to follow me around? Their eyes and smile, every single one of those very different people. From young, old, male, female, they all had that same dead look in their eyes. That same awful smile. So yeah, I'm always afraid. I'm always glancing over my shoulder, looking in the dark corners and shadows. You would be constantly on edge too if you have ever seen a regular-looking dog smirk at you, smile in only a way that a human could possibly do, as if a human was trying to control every feature. And you want to know the worst thing? What is even worse than literally knowing if people around you are actually them or something else? That is the worst. Why are they following me? If the original target, for want of a better word, was my grandmother, who is the only person who truly believes, why did they jump from her to me? Or is more my family under attack? What do they want? I just can't find the right answers, and I don't know who to talk to, or at least who would be willing to talk to me about this. I just want to know why they won't leave me alone. I don't want to spend my entire life being afraid, always looking behind me, never trusting anybody. It's ruined friendships, relationships. Is that what they want? I'm hoping maybe, just maybe, you or somebody can send me in the right direction, or at least tell me that I'm not alone and I can leave them somehow. I just want a normal life again. Is that too much to ask? Can you help me? When my grandfather died when I was just at the tender age of 11, he left behind an old journal that had some crazy stories written inside of it about his time on the Navajo reservation back when he was much younger. He had many written stories about these creatures called Skinwalkers. Of course, I didn't believe any of them. But after what happened the other day, I'm beginning to think that these creatures are real. Not all the stories in the journal were necessarily new to me. I had heard some of the encounters before, but usually, if grandfather began to tell one, my mom would cut him off and give him the look. Sure, she wanted us to know about it and embrace our heritage, but also, she didn't want us constantly looking over our shoulders, wondering if that dog, horse, or whatever it was really just an animal. One of the stories he had managed to sneak was that one of an old lady who seemed to be able to travel remarkably quick, especially for somebody with such advanced years, who was often spotted deep in the woods whilst others were hunting, only then to be found on the reserve an impossibly short time later. To our young minds, that didn't seem particularly scary, more wondrous. She was just a little old lady, maybe with magical powers of speed. Super granny, right? But the things grandfather wrote down were far more detailed and far more frightening, depicting these people as black witches with evil intent, not just old ladies who magically appeared in places too quickly, just to mess with others. These stories involved murder and malice, and if true, would be the stuff of nightmares. Even at 11, when I was just beginning to read more horror and stay up later to catch nighttime movies, I still didn't believe. Sure, to a young kid, say 5 or 6, an old lady could be magical, but to an 11-year-old, witches and these powers grandfather wrote about couldn't be real. I thought that for the next 10 years, until the other day. Funnily enough, it happened back at the family home. I'd moved away a couple of years before, but still visited fairly regularly, and was home for a birthday, actually. Since all of us had moved out, my parents had gotten a dog and wanting some fresh air, and despite it being fairly late in the evening, I'd volunteered to take her for a walk. We headed out into the woods behind the house, where we'd play for hours as kids, and I'd let her run around for a while, all whilst I just enjoyed the clean air. After only a few minutes, I heard her whimpering. My first thought was that she'd maybe stood on a thorn or something. It was dark, but there was still just enough light to see that she was on the floor, shaking and whining, which was odd, since she'll usually pick a fight with anybody, and is fiercely protective. I'd never seen her in this submissive stance before. Then, I saw why. A pair of eyes were glowing through the tree line. It was unnerving to say the least, as the eyes appeared to look human, but were low down like animal level, and I could just about make out the shape of a large dog, more like a wolf. This creature didn't make a noise, didn't bark, growl, nothing. It was stood and watched, and then it seemed to stand up. I don't mean like a dog when it begs. I mean it stood up like a man. My dog yelped, ran over to me, behind my legs, still shaking. I've seen her square up to the other dogs way bigger than her, but she was terrified. I bent down to comfort her, and when I looked again, it was gone. She barked once, running all the way back to the house, not bothering to wait for me, and I could tell you, I was right behind her. My Skinwalker encounter story happened on the Navajo Res. I was living there at the time of my encounter, and it terrified me so much I had to leave. It's a very scary situation, not for people with weak hearts or feeble minds. As you know, I'm from Alaska originally, and have lived most of my life there until I moved down south to Arizona. That's where I met my wife. She's actually part Navajo, and has lots of family up there on the res, in the northern section of New Mexico. We took a liking to it, and at the time, moved up there, just outside of Farmington, New Mexico. For 6 months or more, everything was just fine, moving into our new home. But then things began changing. It all began with some weird sightings of coyotes. I thought nothing much of it at the time, but as things continued to progress, more and more strange happenings were appearing everywhere. When my wife and I would go into the backyard, we'd see hairs hanging in the trees, feathers lying around everywhere, and these weird-looking paw prints left behind. These things alone were not so strange or necessarily frightening, but what really got me freaked out was one night, while my wife and I were sleeping, I woke up at about 3 a.m, and to see this person standing over our bed, dressed in a black robe. This person turned around, staring right at me for a few seconds, then vanishing into thin air. It looked like a dead Native American, with paint on his face. After that, I began checking everything from outside before going inside, to bed, making sure nobody was anywhere. My wife and I were terrified by this sighting, but figured it was just a ghost, or something. Now, fast forward in the late fall of 2007, right after this thing appeared in our bedroom, just as it began getting dark. A lot of strange things began happening in the house. Like our Jack Russell Terrier got really sick with something it had never had before, and then died while we were at work one day. The house would always be freezing cold, even when we turned it up the heat to 80+ degrees. All of our food would go bad. Worms would be crawling in and out of it. It was disgusting. It's like we were plagued by some sort of poltergeist. We heard this constant tapping on the front door every night for about 2 weeks straight. Then all of a sudden, it stopped. That made me feel relieved. I thought whoever or whatever had finally left us alone, so I can get back to some sort of normal routine. We were sitting in our living room, with my wife and I both see this coyote walking up to the back porch, stopping for a second or two, then walking away, back towards a large ravine. It was unusually large for a coyote, twice as big, kind of like a large wolf, with black fur mixed in. The thing that made me want to freak was I saw this animal's eyes. They were human-like. I still have nightmares thinking about that night. Ultimately, I really have no idea how to pinpoint down to the poltergeist I saw and this coyote. I'm looking for opinions here, even though I'm pretty convinced that this was a skinwalker. Both of them were. One was in ghost form, and the other was in shapeshifted form. Obviously, as I already stated, that was more than enough for us, and shortly thereafter, we moved out of there. So, what do you think it was? I'm pretty convinced it was a skinwalker, both times. Hi. Back in 2013, I had a strange encounter with something I can only describe as some kind of skinwalker. For the sake of this story, we're just going to call it an anomaly. It all started one evening while my family and I were heading to visit Area 51 in Nevada. We were having fun on our road trip. Then, we felt this weird sensation, like someone was watching me, but nobody else seemed to notice anything. As soon as that happened though, everything changed. The desert started to get really dark. The sky went all weird, almost like the sun was night, It was very cold, and all I could see was what looked like shadows coming closer to the car we were in. As soon as they got really close, it seemed like time stopped for a second, and everything froze. This is where things got even more strange. Creatures came out of nowhere, out of the darkness, running up to our car, pressing their faces against the window, making everybody scream. The car was stopped to a halt. There was no indication of what these things were, or any specific characteristic about them. They all just looked ugly, distorted, and weird. The only other word I can use to describe them is emotionless. They didn't even seem alive. Have you ever seen Silence of the Lambs? You would probably know what I'm talking about when I use the term emotionless. After some time, we were all so terrified. I told my wife to slam on it, and she flew down the road. There were more of them coming after our car with this unusually dark night. That's when everything began clearing up, and just like that, it was back to evening time. Everything was gone, and we were all freaking out, screaming, wondering what had just happened. I don't know. A few weeks go by though, and I discovered yet another anomaly. This time, up in Ohio with a cousin who had also witnessed something similar when she was starting to drive, right before the same thing happened. Oh, quick note. My cousin told me about how her experiences are different than mine. She said their faces were visible, as if anything wasn't solid was there. As far as when I saw them in Nevada, my cousin claims that she saw more of them, coming down the mountainside. She said they were in front of her car and not just around them. The only thing I can think of is that we either had a mass hallucination, which I don't believe we did, or something paranormal from another realm or interdimensional attacked us or wanted to get us. Me as a family have never experienced anything so terrifying in our lives. How would you even describe the situation or experience to anybody without people giving you a look like they don't believe you? On a back road at night here in Nevada, I saw something I can't explain. I'll start this story off. I'm pretty open-minded. Yes, I believe in God, but I don't really like talking about my sighting on purpose. See, me and two other friends randomly decided to go out one night. So, we're driving around. We went down a back road that we had never been out there before. We drove for a while. It was dead silent. Then, right as we passed an old rundown house with a white trailer behind it, something crossed the road right in front of us. It moved incredibly fast across the road at what seemed like 10 feet in front of our headlights. It was very strange. You could see a human shape very clearly move quickly from left to right. Not running, but almost more of a jumping kind of motion over the ditch next to the road. Before we saw this thing, I was very skeptical about the existence of Skinwalkers. We were all kind of worried to turn around. You never know what could be back there. So, we drove a mile or two down the road and were still pretty freaked out, but trying not to think too much about it. A few minutes later, and we go into a curve and slow down. That's when we see something on the other side of the road, from left to right, almost at the same place where we first spotted, well, whatever that thing was that we saw. As gross as this thing looked, it reminded me of some sort of giant rat that walked upright. I don't know. What killed the thought is the fact that we had all seen it well in our minds and will almost never forget it. It kind of held its arms below its knees, like how a primate would walk. When we saw this thing a second time, it stopped for a solid 3 seconds, then bolted back in the direction that it came from, which made us feel better about driving off and not turning around, just to see if something was behind us. Now, we still don't know exactly what these things were, but my friends and I have come up with some pretty good theories. My first theory is that they are outcasts from the Navajo tribe who have gone mad, and now are on a hunt to do revenge killing of some sort. Or, another theory could be that they are born and bred on the reservation. These skinwalkers can change form from anything to a human, deer, coyote, etc. So, this is mine and my friend's experience with something unexplainable. I'll say this: never go out at night, Nevada or alone anywhere for that matter. Keep your eyes peeled, and just because you don't believe doesn't mean it's not real. I was a senior in school in 2018, and we did a project about spiritual. I was a senior in my high school back in 2018. I was fortunate enough to do a project about spiritual creatures living in different places around the globe, all over the world. I'm doing as much research as I can concerning skinwalkers, so if anybody has any knowledge about it, please post a comment below. Let me know what you think. Anyway, there's an old Navajo legend that has been passed down for generations. It tells of a race of creatures that can shapeshift into anything they want or need to be in order to get whatever it is they are after. Shapeshifting was seen as the ultimate achievement one could make. Only people who possessed specific traits of magic could do this. They would wear animal skins and pelts, and they could become whatever creature their hearts desired, in hoping and avoiding detection from other magics who may cause them harm or reveal them if discovered. This way of life went unnoticed by non-magical humans, until one day, two young boys noticed something odd while out hunting with their father. When drifting back on the winds, they could hear the sounds of strange animals and odd hissing noises. One boy became curious. His father knew this, and rather than answer or investigate, he told them he was too close to chase such old things. These young boys decided they needed to see what these noises were. They followed the sound down a small hill until they themselves came face to face with a skinwalker. One man, whom we'll call Russell, claimed to have encountered one of these creatures himself while driving late at night through some rural areas. He declared that it looked like an older Navajo woman wearing traditional clothing. As Russell approached her on the deserted road, she began walking toward him, and as she walked, her appearance changed that from an old woman into something much more sinister. If Russ at all thought that would have been the end of it, he was wrong. As she changed into this new form, all sorts of things began flying from her body, all around his car. It was almost like a Dracula thing, where her body dematerialized into bats. After trying to escape, Russ finally outran the creature, who was in hot pursuit for most of the time. She had transformed into this hideous thing, running after his car. Although after a while, when he looked back, he could not see her anywhere, even though there was nothing that could have prevented his vision. Again, 1995, another family living near Farmington, New Mexico, reported seeing several skinwalkers at the front of their house. The rest of the story goes as follows. The mother and father had just awakened after hearing something outside their home, right around midnight. They both noticed something walking on two legs, but realized it was not a man. They weren't sure what it was. It was walking up and down, and had a very human shape. They were then able to see the face. It had long black hair, and a face kind of like a coyote. The dad quickly went to the door, grabbing his gun. The mother began screaming, and that's when they saw multiples of these things come towards the door very fast, trying to almost attack the father and break into the house. There's just story after story of these creatures out there, and I don't believe for a second any of this is just a figment of our imagination. Something is going on. I was born and raised on a reservation in Nevada. This is very true and very terrifying at times. Years ago, my mother told me that when she was little, her brother had told her to go play in the other room, so she did. Apparently, she had seen the spirit of a coyote with her mother outside. She was told later on that was just the spirit of her grandmother who had passed away years before. She had asked her brother how he knew about this, and he said that nobody told him. Years later, the mother told stories about seeing strange spirits lurking around the house at night, under the light of a full moon. I was able to ask other family members if they see these strange spirits too. All of them said yes. We have many mediums, clairvoyants, and psychics in our family, or so I'm told. I'll also never forget the one time I was riding around in town with my mother. We took a shortcut through some desert. As we're driving through, there's no trail, but we had taken this road many times. We were stopped, and I look off to the right and see these two coyotes coming towards us. All of a sudden, now they take off running towards us. My mom floors it, and they stand up on two legs running after our truck. She said that she could hear their claws on the side of the road as they're flying at the truck. Then all of a sudden, just as soon as they had appeared, they completely disappeared into thin air. Even though I haven't seen a skinwalker with my own eyes, yet I know some of these are crazy stories. I believe that I'm seeing skinwalker spirits. I'm not sure what they are. I've been reading up on the subject of skinwalkers now for many years. I'm still not really sure what to believe, but it's given me material for many campfire tales. One story that is true and happened just recently actually is that an old ranch hand was working by himself when he saw this strange being come out of some trees near an old tool shack. The person shapeshifted into a coyote, then back again to a human form as it came towards. He went inside and locked up. Hours later, the boss man came back in his truck with a friend who was some kind of Native American shaman or something. They wanted to know if he'd seen anything strange. Hours earlier, they had been out in the hills searching for some missing cattle and had found dozens of mutilated ones with strange symbols carved into them. That's when they suspected that it could be some sort of witch doing these killings. The boss told me after hearing that story that he does believe there are good Native American witches out there who help fight these bad witches, but it has to be a personal mission from within their hearts to do something like that. The one commonality among all these stories about skinwalkers is how they all state just how powerful they are. It seems impossible at times and makes you wonder how they could even be real. I know it's hard to believe, but the stories are coming from all over the world. So something has to be going on that cannot be explained by logic and reasoning alone. From the sounds of things, these beings are deeply embedded into a Native American culture as we speak. I have a ranch in Maverick County, Texas. It's very remote, and quite frankly, I'm not sure how I ended up with it. But the deed is in my name, so here I am. Let's just say it occurred from a little family mishap. Last year was the first time I'd ever actually been down there. Prior to that, no one had ever lived on the land for years, and it was very overgrown. Lots of trees and brush and God knows what else. But you couldn't see any of that from satellite. I mean, we're talking dense vegetation. I know that's a weird analogy, but I'm just trying to iterate how dense the vegetation was. Anyway, before finally going out there myself, I had spent a lot of time talking to people who knew about the property, some of whom were pretty well versed in local folklore. The long and short of it is, I don't know what to expect. I figured it would be a lot of work, but if the rumors I'd heard were true, then the payoff could be worth it. And they were. There's plenty of open pasture, readily available for grazing and watering. The fences weren't in good shape, but some time and money could easily fix that. There were also dozens of little feeder streams that led down into the main creek, which crosses the property. Plenty of water for animals. It's perfect. The whole place looks like somebody just plopped down a large chunk of land and forgot to tell anybody about it. One guy even told me he thought at one point, during its time as an isolated ranch, locals would sneak out there at night and drive their cattle across it, on the way into Maverick County from Starr County. Remember, I'm talking about a place that was completely overgrown. Nobody would have been able to see them doing it. I've got several hundred acres fenced off for grazing, but in the middle of my land is this one little spot which has been left untouched by animals or humans. There's no grass or low-lying plants of any kind, just hard stone and dirt. It's an area that measures maybe 15 feet across at its widest point, and is shaped like a perfect square. As soon as I saw that weird patch of ground, when I first went down there last year, I knew immediately what it was. And I'm not talking about an old well or anything like that. This is much older than that. It's what the locals call a Skinwalker place. The first time I set foot on my land was in late August of last year. It took me almost 3 months to get back down there. Again, I just started working a new job at a cattle ranch, which is almost an hour away from the property. In October, after finally getting around to checking out my land with some contractors and local guys who had experience building fences and such, we built a small house on top of one of the hills overlooking both pastures, where we could stay while doing work. Before I had the place fenced off, I used to see lots of deer. We also fixed up some of the fence and the gate. But other than that, the only thing we really did was cut down all the overgrown brush and trees where we planned on building a house. I left with nothing but good things to say. It's not very densely populated, especially when you're way out between there. It's one of the most beautiful places, as if you don't mind being away from civilization. The people out there are very friendly. It's a great place to kick back, getting away from it all, and do some hunting or fishing if that's your thing, which is what I was really after when I bought the land there in the first place. A quiet place off the beaten path where you can go to chill, relax, without having to deal with people constantly coming up to you or acting like they own you. The weather out there during the summertime is absolutely gorgeous. During my first trip down, it was inevitable that I'd have to go and visit. Weird things around the ranch began to happen. Weird symbols being etched into the ground, strange noises, and weird figures moving about. I normally don't believe in the paranormal, but I can't exactly explain what it was that I was seeing or experiencing. After a couple of days down there, a few of the workers I had fixing and patching up the fence were too afraid. They stopped altogether and left. I never saw some of those guys again. I decided to rough it out and try to get more men up on the ranch, but same thing. They reported seeing strange figures and weird noises, and that it spooked them so badly, they refused to work there any longer. I was only able to stay there for so long, before ultimately having to go back home. After I flew back home, I had contracted a separate team from out of state to show up there and fix the property up, while I was back home in a different state. I kept getting phone calls. Same thing. Workers would get up and leave during the middle of the day and night due to the same complaints as the other previous men. Then I get a very interesting phone call. This is where things get strange. The man I could tell was native, just from the way he talked. He claimed he was a medicine man from one of the local tribes. And forgive me because I can't remember the tribe in which he was a part of. But he said to me that he was a medicine man and that the land I owned, which he got my credentials and information from some of the men he saw working there, was sacred land, and many of his people had died there long before. He said his people still roamed about and that it's not safe that I have a house being built on it. He told me it would probably be in my best interest to abandon any development and let the property go back. As you can imagine, I was a bit taken aback by this phone call as I wasn't really sure what to believe. But after getting on the internet and doing a little bit of research on Google, I found out that there was some really weird stuff going on with not only that property, but that whole sector of land. I'm a little bit short on time right now, so I'll have to write you into this as a part 2, if you don't mind. But for the time being, if you have any questions or comments about what's going on, I would love to hear them. I still own the property as of now, of August of 2021, and I'm debating whether or not to sell it or give it away to one of my other family members. I don't know if I want to deal with this, but anyway, like I said, I'll write into you part 2 about more of the strange things that have been happening there. I still believe Skinwalkers exist among the Navajo, down by the res. I'm a third-generation Navajo, so I've heard all about these types of creatures from my great-grandparents, actually. They used to sit around the fire and tell us all sorts of Skinwalker stories back when we were little. They always said it was important that we learn about them. They're still around as far as the res is concerned. My first encounter ever took place at night. I was asleep in my room with the shades wide open. It was pitch black outside. I had just gone to bed not too long before, when suddenly, I hear this loud scream coming from far from the distance. It made me feel chills go up my spine. To describe it, it was like somebody being tortured. And what's more terrifying is it was a scream coming right outside my bedroom window. I was paralyzed with fear, and I remember I couldn't move a muscle. But it wasn't until that moment did I realize just how dark the room really was. Even though there were some streetlights shining into my room from outside, I could still hear movement coming towards my house. Something big. Fear continued to grow inside me as something approached. The movement ceased, and that's when I began to hear loud thumping around walking on the porch. I heard this big bang against my front door. That's when I knew something had gotten into the house. It, in doing so, knocked over a small table where I'd always keep mail and keys on. This was located right outside my room. Now I still could not move, and I got the feeling that whatever this thing was, it wanted me to know it was there. The thumping sound began coming towards my bedroom door, located across from my bed, then suddenly stopped once again. Then, I heard a very loud bang on the door right behind me on the wall. When I looked back, there was nothing. I was terrified at this point. The thumping started walking back towards the front door right behind my bed. That's when I heard the movement towards my bedroom window start again. The whole time, I couldn't move, even though I wanted to get out of there so badly. It felt like an eternity before the knocking really started. Right at that moment, I got the feeling like whatever this thing was, it wanted me to feel the fear of not being able to move, feeling trapped. Then I heard another loud bang on the window, as though something had jumped hard against it. And to my horror, I realized there were multiple of these things, not just one. While all this was happening, I was terrified to death, frozen. Then I heard more thumping, walking away from my bedroom and outside. That's when the moment where I heard everything just suddenly stop. It was an incredible feeling of relief. I got up out of my bed, turned on my bedroom light, expecting to see something in the room, but there was nothing there. I felt this sense of relief that whatever it was had finally left. But suddenly, I heard loud scratching noises coming from outside the window right behind me where it had just been standing. I turned around towards my window. That's when I could see something trying to break in. The window itself was shaking, as if something was trying to stick its hands in. Something from outside. That's when I began to hear this voice, calling my name, in this almost low whisper raspy noise. It sounded like a man's voice, but the tone was distorted and wrong. I couldn't tell exactly where it was coming from, even though it sounded like it was coming from this thing. It also sounded like it was coming from in my room and inside the house at the same time. I got up out of my bed, running out of the room, even though I had heard one of these things out there, and I had no idea what I would meet. I ran out of the room, running to my sister's room, not skipping a beat. Now, as I'm doing this, the thumping sound begins to walk towards my sister's door, where I thought the noise was outside of. Something began pounding its fist against the wall of the trailer, or the house right outside the hallway, and her bedroom. That's when I heard more thumping on the other side of the house as well. We were being invaded. I was expecting to see something when I opened my sister's room, but there was nothing. Now, the sound had stopped as soon as I had entered the room, although I could hear the things walking along outside the trailer. I ran to her window, looking outside the screen, and I could see one of these things walking right outside along our window, still tapping its hand along the wall, and I saw a couple more of them joining. After that night, we had never heard or seen anything else like that again. That was easily the most terrifying memory I have. Nothing happened after that until a year or so later, after I had just gotten married, moving in with my husband. We had just bought our first house and we were settling in, when we began to hear strange noises from all parts of the house, and even sometimes upstairs. We'd hear things like footsteps, moving furniture, things being knocked over on a regular basis. My husband is an atheist, so he doesn't believe anything supernatural could be going on. Assumed I was just hearing things. One day, as we're both sitting and talking in the living room that my husband built, there was this loud bang coming from upstairs. It sounded like somebody dropped a large metal vase. I went up to see what it was while my husband stayed downstairs. I got up to the top of the stairs and nothing was there. So I turned around to go back down, and as I did, this loud crash occurred just outside our house. Both my husband and I run down and we look outside, but are unsuccessful in seeing anything. The next night, my husband was talking on the phone in our living room while I was upstairs cleaning the bathroom, when we all heard an audible knock on the front door. The only problem is that nobody had knocked. My husband heard it clearly, so it's not like one of us was crazy. We both walk over to the door, expecting somebody to be standing there, but nothing. Another night, my husband went upstairs to take a nap, while I stayed downstairs to watch TV. He's going up the stairs, looks back at me, and says, "I love you," goes upstairs into our bedroom, and begins to take a nap. After a short amount of time, I heard him calling my name in an urgent tone of voice. My husband is pretty much never urgent, so I knew something was wrong. He gets up there and he's wide-eyed. He said that he was laying there, and he looked over and saw me come in the room and stand at the front of the bed. Apparently, I had black eyes and a distorted face, and my skin looked dead. That's when he began screaming and urgently asking for me. And after that, this fake me vanished in the air. We didn't know what to make of these experiences. At first, I would just assume it was a poltergeist, but something more is here. After a while, we got used to these strange sounds coming from our house and stuff being knocked over. I'm beginning to think there's an angry Skinwalker spirit that is following me and has attached itself to me. What's your take on all of this? Even though I grew up Navajo, I never participated in much of our culture, rituals, or religions. I've always kind of just done my own thing, but now I feel like I've somehow made myself a target. Do you know how to get rid of something like this without it hurting somebody? I have a baby now. I don't want anything messing with her. Thank you for your time. Skinwalkers, I believe, have been on this earth in one form or another for many, many years. Skinwalkers, as you know, are evil beings that take the form of a man or an animal. They are believed to be able to shapeshift into other creatures, like wolves or coyotes. They possess powers beyond those of normal men and animals, including the abilities to run at speeds greater than a normal man. Skinwalkers are believed to cause mischief, sickness, and death amongst their victims. In order to become one must go through an initiation ritual that requires great strength and determination. The first test is to kill the person who taught you how to perform the ritual. The next test is to kill your close family members, sometimes including but not limited to parents and siblings. I firmly suspect that my grandfather, now passed, was indeed a Navajo witch, a Skinwalker. My grandmother would tell me all sorts of terrifying stories. Fortunately for me, he passed before I was born, and he died of an unknown illness. But I heard from family and my grandmother that he was a very wicked man. Abusive, cruel, sadistic. My grandmother explained to me that he ultimately loved pain, giving and taking. She believes that's probably one of the biggest factors why he got involved in black magic and shapeshifting. He would often leave at night, be gone for days, come back with pelts dirty, covered in filth and animal blood, doing and acting crazy ways. One time, my grandmother told me he had apparently killed off several livestock and eaten them. He had been shot at by farmers and even nearly killed. The man was reckless, dangerous, and a threat to our family. I can't help but wonder if the way he died was as mysterious as everybody says, or maybe the black magic he so practiced ended up ending his life. Maybe somebody took him out. I'll never know. But I guess in some twisted sense, I'm glad I was never around to actually meet him. This is my story. It was around 7 p.m. I was 16. I had a bag of M&Ms in my hand, walking the 2 miles to the store that was here on the reservation. The store was only around a mile from my house, well, at least the point I was in my walk. It was dark, and there were no streetlights on this road, which I guess is fairly common. I began walking back home after I got to the store and got more snacks and a Mountain Dew. I began walking when I noticed something moving towards me, only about 100 feet away. I thought to myself, maybe it's a dog, but this thing kept getting closer, and that's when I realized it was not a normal animal. It was this tall, skinny man walking on 2 legs like normal, but it looked more like a dog. At this point, I thought about running, but I could tell it was a creature and not a man. This thing had really long arms, like a monkey. By the time this creature got around me and looked at me as it came, it stopped. Its eyes were pitch black and pupils, looking like that of a snake. I was in total shock and I ran as fast as I could. This thing or person did not follow me. I told my mother and brother about what I saw. They didn't believe me. As I got older, I began to tell more people about it, but still, nobody believed my story. Around 2 years ago, I told my boss at work, who is full-blooded Navajo. He is the only one, other than my other family, who believed me. I told him that I would not mind if he wanted me to talk about it. He did, said that it was what he would call a skinwalker. Since then, we become good friends outside of work and discuss paranormal things often. Skinwalkers, I learned, are shape-shifting beings. They are generally all around the reservation and act as guardians, although I'm not too sure on that last part. They feed on fear and have been known to get inside people's homes at night. How terrifying. I have never experienced seeing a skinwalker again, but I firmly now believe they exist after seeing one with my own eyes.